We've looked at scriptural underpinnings or the reference points concerning slavery, and now I want to look at the historical record. If I were to go on in the streets and ask anybody who has had the problem with slavery the most, they would say, well, the Europeans have had the problem with slavery because that's where slavery has existed, that's where it was developed, that's where it was basically eradicated. So therefore, it's really a European problem. And when I talk to Muslims, this seems to be their view as well. They seem to think that this is uniquely a Christian problem and not a Muslim problem. And I always have to scratch my head on that one and say, hold on a minute. Have you looked at the historical record? Is slavery not also a Muslim problem? I want to quote now from Robert Hughes, who writes in the Time magazine, and he says this: "The African slave trade as such, the black traffic, was an Arab invention, developed by traders with the enthusiastic collaboration of black African ones. Institutionalized with the most unrelenting brutality, centuries before the white man appeared on the African continent, and continuing long after the slave market in North America was finally crushed. Nothing in the writing of the Prophet Muhammad forbids slavery, as we saw in the Quran earlier, which is why it became such an Arab-dominated business. And the slave traffic could not have existed without the wholehearted cooperation of African tribal states, built on the supply of captives generated by the relentless wars. The image promulgated by pop history fictions like Roots, Alex Haley's Roots, of white slavers bursting with cutlass and musket into the settled lives of peaceful African villages is far from the historical truth. A marketing system had been in place for centuries, and its supply was controlled by Africans. Nor did it simply vanish with abolition. Slave markets supplying the Arab Emirates were still operating in Djibouti in the 1950s. And since 1960, the slave trade has flourished in Mauritania and the Sudan. There are still reports of chattel slavery in northern Nigeria, Rwanda, and Niger. Now, there has been a study done on slavery, specifically by a man here, an African, here at Birmingham University named Dr. John Azuma, a good friend of mine. And he did a study of looking at the African slave trade, and more specifically the Islamic slave trade from East Africa. And he noticed that when you do a comparative between the two different coasts of Africa where the slaves went, when you look at the West African slave that went out from the West out into South America and North America and also the Caribbean, there were roughly 10 to 12 million slaves that went from that area over a period of 370 years, from 1500 up to 1780 or 1870, sorry, what am I saying? 1500 to 1870, so 370 years. So it's a very short period of time when it was finally eradicated and destroyed. Now we know about that trade. In fact, there's been reams of books written on it. That's why we know so much about it. We know where their descendants are. Their descendants have justifiably not only talk about it, but claim for reparations. We know where they live because we can see them today. You can go to South America. You can go to places like Brazil. You can go to the Dominican Republic, to places like Haiti. You can come to my country, the United States, and you'll see over 30 million of their descendants living today. So nobody doubts that that slave system existed, and nobody doubts where their descendants are. They are still alive and well today and flourishing. But Dr. Zuma asked a very much greater question. He said, well, what about the East Coast slaves, those that went off the east coast of Africa, places like Zanzibar, the slave island, and Lamu in Kenya, where there were hundreds, not just hundreds, he says, there were millions of slaves that left the east coast of Africa. As many as anywhere from 14 to 18 million left the east coast of Africa from 650 AD all the way up until 1905 AD. That's 1,255 years. That's 3 times the time period of those that went off the west coast of Africa. Why is it we're not hearing about that slave trade? 18 million slaves left East Coast. Where'd they go to? They didn't come to the west. They couldn't have. They couldn't have gone around the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa. Why? Because it would have been dangerous. First of all, it would have been prohibitively expensive. So where did those slaves go to? Well, they all went up the Indian Ocean, and of course you all know the answer. They all went up into what is today known as the Muslim world, the Middle East, and of course further up into during the Ottoman period, up into the Ottoman Sultanate. 18 million of them. What's more, he said, when you look at the types of slavery that existed, He said those that went off the west coast to the Americas weren't to basically supply plantations. They were used as workers in the great big plantations in South America and also North America, especially the southern part of North America. They needed them for labor. But those who went off the east coast did not have plantations. Initially there were some plantations, certainly during the Abbasid period, but after that there was no need for plantations, and therefore the slaves that kept on coming up were of a specific kind. In the West, they brought whole families, and certainly many men, because they needed the families to produce more children to create more slaves. It was profitable to do that. In the East, they didn't need men, because men were not needed for slave labor. They needed mainly women and children. And so the men were killed off, and it was the women and children that were taken. Many of the men that were retained were castrated. And what we do know from the records, according to Dr. Zuma, is that of those men that were retained who were castrated, 85% of them died before they got to their destination. Primarily because of infection. Now, why aren't we hearing about this slave trade? And what's more, and here's the question he asked that I find is pertinent. Where are their descendants today? We know where the descendants are that went off to the West. They still exist today. They live today. We can go talk to them. We should have anywhere from 80 to 100 million descendants living in the Middle East today who've gone from the East Coast. Where are they? Why has no one asked this question? Why is it Dr. Zuma is the first one to ask this question? It's a question I ask, and it's a question I leave with you. This is going to cause some problem. I know some Muslims are going to get very upset by what I've just said. But you see, we've dealt with our slavery over on this side. We've eradicated it. And it was Christians that started it. It was William Wilberforce who created and started the whole abolition movement, which then had rippling effects right across the world. Islam has never done that. There has never been an abolition movement. I don't know of any abolition movement that has succeeded in Islam. What's more, here's something else that needs to be asked. It wasn't until 1960 that Saudi Arabia finally made slavery illegal. And the last remaining country to illegalize slavery, to abolish slavery, was Mauritania in 1981. We're in 2007. Do your maths. That's recent history. Why did it take so long for the Muslim countries to eradicate slavery? Well, a lot of it has to do with this book right here. It's because of what the Quran says. Because of those references that I talked to in the earlier video. Surah 33, ayah 50 to 52. Surah 16, ayah 71. And it's this question that Muslims need to answer. If their Quran supports it, if their whole history has been replete with it, then how can they say that this is a Christian problem? When we have eradicated it. We are at the forefront of that eradication. Islam has not eradicated it. In fact, it still exists today. That's why Baroness Cox still films herself buying slaves and then freeing them on camera to prove it still exists today in uniquely Muslim countries. Islam has an awful lot to answer for on this question. Now, I know this is going to be a debate that's going to go on and on. There's going to be a lot of recriminations on YouTube because of what I've just said. I expect it. But as we move into 2008, we need to look back and we need to ask some damaging questions concerning our history and also the history of Islam. And this is one of them that Islam needs to answer. Now, I leave that, and of course we'll get some response back in 2008. But let's continue with this debate. Let's continue talking about it, because I find as I get into these kind of issues, it's fascinating how I can come back to the Bible, I can come back to the example of Jesus Christ, I can come back to the history of the church, and I can come back to those who preceded me, and I can see and look by their example that there's something unique about the Bible. There's something unique about what Paul was saying there in Galatians 3:28. There's something unique about the God of the Bible that says we're all created equal, that allows me to look at my brother, no matter what color he is, and says, there's no reason for slavery. There's no reason at all, because of who we are, related to God, made in His image. This is Jathan, over and out.